This is Indian Country Today.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Mark Trahant. Here are the headlines from Indian Country Today. There was a lot of news last week. The confirmation hearings for Representative Deb Haaland, lots of vaccine distribution in Indigenous communities. One story that almost slipped by. President Joe Biden had a meeting with Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, about relations between the two nations. Included in that discussion was an agreement on how to build back better and to address the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on women, youth, underrepresented groups, and Indigenous people. A joint statement looked at the role of climate policy. In advancing climate solutions and protecting nature, both the President and the Prime Minister agreed on the importance of doing this work with Indigenous peoples, sub-national governments, workers, and stakeholders, including civil society, youth, business, and industry. Nearly a year after the Congress passed a coronavirus relief bill, some tribal governments remain in legal limbo over what's been distributed. The issue didn't become any clearer for three tribes that argued during a federal court hearing last week in Washington, D.C., that they were shortchanged under the formula used to dole out a portion of the $8 billion set aside for tribes because of the way tribal populations are counted. The Shawnee tribe in Oklahoma and the Miccosukee tribe of Indians in Florida were among those given the minimum of $100,000 because the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development data showed they had a population of 0. The Prairie Band Potawatomi Nation in Kansas has argued it should have received $7.65 million more than it got, based on its own enrollment data. In the Shawnee case, the tribe's attorney, Pilar Thomas, urged the court to prevent further delays. "We are still in a pandemic, and we are still without the money," she said. The court has asked for an accounting of interim payments by the end of this week. Emotions ran high last week as a Montana House committee heard a bill that would make it easier for Native Americans to vote. The bill would require at least 2 satellite election offices on each of the state's 7 reservations with the same services as county election offices, beginning when mail ballots are sent and until polls close on Election Day for every state and federal election. The legislation also adds the words "valid" to tribal identification and would recognize non-traditional addresses as long as the voter provides enough information to be assigned to a precinct. Many rural tribal residents do not have physical addresses. Supporters, including tribal leaders, Western Native Voice, and Montana Native Vote, testified that the bill would help address barriers to voting that exist for people living on tribal lands, in part by requiring ballot drop boxes in towns that are more than 10 miles from a satellite election office. The legislation is sponsored by Democratic Representative Sharon Stewart Pergoy from Crow Agency. Meanwhile, Congress begins debating this week on sweeping voting and ethics legislation. Democrats and Republicans can agree on one thing. If signed into law, it would usher in the biggest overhaul of U.S. election law in at least a generation. House Resolution 1, a Democratic 791-page bill, would touch virtually every aspect of the electoral process, striking down hurdles to voting erected in the name of election security, curbing partisan gerrymandering, and curtailing the influence of big money in politics. Republicans see those very measures as threats that would limit the power of states to conduct elections and ultimately benefit Democrats, notably with higher turnout among minority voters. Barriers to voting are as old as the country, but in more recent history they have come in the form of voter ID laws and other restrictions that are up for debate in state houses across the country. Representative John Sarbanes, a Maryland Democrat who sponsored the bill, said that outside of Congress these aren't controversial reforms. Much of it, he noted, was derived from recommendations from a bipartisan commission. Yet, to many Republicans, it amounts to an unwarranted federal intrusion into a process that states should control. Representative Rodney Davis, a Republican from Illinois, called the voting rights bill 800 pages of election mandates and free speech regulations that pose a threat to democracy and would weaken voter confidence in elections. And in Arizona, there is a sure sign of spring and a sense of optimism. At Salt River Fields at Talking Stick, owned by the Salt River Indian community, baseball spring training kicked off the 2021 season. The crowd was capped at about 2,200 fans, which is about 16% of the usual capacity. Still, the fans could not wait to be in the sun and start another season of hope. And those are the headlines from Indian Country today. I'm Mark Trahant. When we come back, we'll meet a native artist whose work is featured in a Russian arts museum. Dynamics of Russian Colonialism in Alaska is the first solo exhibition of work by Marlena Myles. It focuses on the intersection of immigrant and native peoples in North America. You can see it at the Museum of Russian Art in Minneapolis, Minnesota until March 14th. Marlena Myles is a self-taught Spirit Lake Dakota, Mohegan and Muscogee. Her art brings modernity to Indigenous history, languages, and oral traditions. Growing up on her traditional Dakota homelands in the Twin Cities, she enjoys using her artwork to teach Minnesotans of all backgrounds the Indigenous history of this place we called home. She has done children's books, fabrics, animations, and fine art. Welcome, Marlena.
Happy to be here.
Tell me about the exhibit at the Russian Art Museum.
Yeah, the exhibit, I worked with the Russian Art Museum. Growing up, I loved Russian history. I loved Russian literature, music. And I never thought as a Native American that I could be in the museum. But they had wanted to, widen their base of who they're reaching because their museum is located in a Native sort of neighborhood of Minneapolis. So they reached out to me and I did about a year's worth of research on the interactions between the Russians and Alaskan natives. And the work I created, I don't try to put myself into the story of the Russians or Native Alaskans. I just try to, open people's minds to what went on and how people today are still affected by that history.
One of the things I really like about this project is that we think all the time about US or even British colonialism, but the idea of expanding that to other countries, I think, is really significant.
Yeah, and there's differences in how they treated Native people. Of course, there's still the genocide and that going on, but there are also, the Russian Orthodox Church is actually more kind than maybe the missionaries in other locations. So it was interesting for me to learn a different history than the one that I know about my people, I guess, and the interactions with Europeans.
Maybe tell us about some of the items in the exhibit.
Yeah, I did a few pieces on metal, few pieces on canvas, but then there's an animation that illustrates the Ninilchik Russian because there's an Alaskan native village that was started by the Russian men and their Alaskan native wives, and the Russian that they still speak there today is very archaic. It's not something they speak in Moscow. So the younger people of that village today, they can't speak Russian like their elders do, and so they are recording as much of it and documenting as much of it as they can before it passes away when their elders passes away. So it reminds me of a lot of the language revitalization that Native people are doing around the country.
So much of your work involves digital imagery. What drew you to using computers to express yourself?
Yeah, well, I grew up in Minneapolis, in an urban environment. And so I think Native people have always been innovative. Whenever we get a new piece of technology, we find a way to tell our culture, our history through it. And so as a kid, my mom bought us a computer so that we would stay out of trouble. And I really got into coding and making my own art onto it as a teenager back before everybody had this kind of technology. Because I guess it was in 1998, back when people had dial-up internet. So I was in the early days of the internet that I was starting my digital art journey.
Where did you start playing around with fractals?
Well, I was always good at math. When I was in like fourth grade, I was already doing algebra. So fractals are very mathematic based. You can see a lot of patterns in it. So that's really inspired the work that I do in Illustrator with patterns as well, because you do a lot of math when you're working on these sort of pieces of art. So that's why I think fractals and vectors have always appealed to me. Just like organically, my mind is drawn to the mathematical nature of those programs.
One aspect of that mathematics is the idea of really infinity.
Yeah. Yeah, because I mean, with vectors, you can scale it to any size, or you can zoom in like 36,000%, and see things that you can't normally see with a painting. Like sometimes my brain, like I'll be reading a magazine, my brain will start doing that, trying to zoom in on the picture, just because I've been so used to doing that with digital art. So it's kind of hard for me when I'm not on the computer to like learn to step back and learn. I actually had to move my whole body in order to zoom or not zoom, kind of a thing.
You've also done a lot of work for children. Maybe tell us about that and what motivates you there.
Yeah, well, growing up in an urban area, there was never anything that really taught about Dakota people. It's the same with like that exhibit when I did for the Russians and Alaskan Natives. I think most of us just learn a paragraph about how America bought Alaska, and that's it. Like you don't learn anything else. And so, growing up here in the Twin Cities, there was never anything that talked about the Dakota people here. So that's why I wanted to create free resources like the Dakota land map that shows our language is still here today, that we're still here today, that our languages aren't just stuck in the past, that we have words for everyday things as well. So, I want the urban kids to look at Minneapolis and realize, this is our home too. It's not just your reservation, like our homelands include these big urban areas.
Well, and you really get that sense of future from your work because it looks forward as much as back.
Yeah, and, kids, they love technology, so I hope it encourages them, to look at how they can use it, to tell either their own personal stories or their family stories or their tribe stories too.
How has the pandemic changed your work?
I mean, I don't do any art markets. I haven't done any of those, and exhibitions, they've all been virtual. But like my own personal work, since I've already been working on the computer at home, I do a lot of Zoom meetings and emails already. So none of that has changed. But the whole presenting my art to the public, I think that has changed a lot. And some of it's bad, but some of it's good too, because I'm going to be doing like an augmented reality project that will take place here in St. Paul at Indian Burial Mounds Park. And people will be able to walk through the park and experience my art in like a safe way, I think. And it'll be called the Dakota Spirit Walk. And they have 4 spirits, and they'll teach you different aspects of our philosophies and how we connect with nature. And so I think that to me, that's a good way of, using the situation that we're in to the best that we can.
Maybe explain for some of our viewers what augmented reality is.
Yeah, I think some people, they might see their kids playing with like Pokemon Go or something, and you hold your phone up and you're on your camera screen, it interjects like a 3-dimensional art or figure or something that you can walk around, you can interact with, it can make noises and stuff. And so we're so used to sitting on our phones that I think this will be a fun way to, be entertained, but also experience Native stories, because our stories are here all the time. Native people, we know these stories, but like the general public, they're not able to see it through our eyes. So I feel like this augmented reality will let them see how we see our connections to the land, I think, through their phones, through this modern piece of technology. So it's a fun way to bring like ancient stories into people's hands.
Wow, and you think about the phone just being kind of the beginning of augmented reality when we're not that far off from people looking at through their glasses and getting a little history as they walk forward. I mean, it really is mind-boggling what can happen with that technology.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it, and I know there's a lot of I've had interest from other Native artists from around the country. They're asking me how can I use this technology? Because I think we all have that same passion of, you know, um, educating the public on our stories, because I feel like that makes it easier for us to exist in the United States when people know we are here and know what's important to us.
What's next for you?
But augmented reality is something I'm working on. I'm also starting a Dakota publishing company that will publish like Dakota books and free resources and things like that, because there's not really that many resources for kids to access, like media for them to hold in their hands and learn the language. And they're bombarded by all kinds of pop culture stuff around them that I want them to see our culture is just as cool as Spider-Man and all that. So that's what my next venture is.
That's really exciting. When you talk to young people about technology, how do you get them to think that this is something that exists that we can use?
Well, I like to show how easy it is. I mean, how accessible it can be. I like to share like my screen of what I'm working on with people so that, they'll tell their parents too what apps they can be downloading to get their kids interested. And really, I think once kids get it in their hands, their natural, like inquisitive nature sort of drives them, drives their talent, drives their potential. So really just give them the tools and they'll figure it out. They're a lot smarter than we give kids credit for.
Well, and they grow up with this. I mean, it's such a natural thing it's not that big a leap to go from Facebook to Fractals.
Yeah, it's not. Like, I've watched tutorials where a 10-year-old is teaching me things, so it's crazy how kids can get these programs so quickly.
We have about a minute left. What excites you about art as we go forward in this era?
I think to me, it's being able to educate people through art. They go to the art museums and they learn our stories. They learn the importance of, what our ancestors were doing when they created these pieces of works, and how we're passing on these same stories, maybe in a different way, but we're still passing on the same values. So that's what gets me excited about art.
Well, and when it comes down to it, really is always about the stories.
Yeah.
Thank you, Marlena Myles, a multimedia artist living in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
When we come back, we'll hear from Annette Pember about the pipelines in Minnesota. Annette Pember is a national correspondent here at Indian Country Today. She joins us to talk about her recent stories about the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline. Welcome, Mary.
Hi, great to be here, Mark.
So how did this story unfold? Where did you start?
Well, actually, I've been wanting to write about, Enbridge's work there in the North Country for quite some time. I focused this time, though, to begin on Enbridge Line 3, which is the line they're currently working on that goes from Alberta, Canada, a little bit south of Minnesota, and then east over to Superior, Wisconsin.
One of the things I liked in your stories that I think is so often missing from journalism is complexity. That it's not just an easy call to say this is where people stand. It's a lot more nuanced.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think especially in Indian country, we often see in the mainstream press that Native folks are depicted as being totally fur or again, as my mother would say, but there's so much more nuance that goes on. The Fond du Lac leadership, the Fond du Lac tribal leadership in Minnesota has opted, they have an agreement with Enbridge to allow them to go through the reservation rather than go around. I think they decided that, in fact, the route around would actually endanger more waterways. But at any rate, they are a sovereign entity, and their leadership did make an agreement with Enbridge, and they're very sophisticated people, Fond du Lac folks, and probably Enbridge too. But as far as business dealings, and however, they are a sovereign nation, but like other, entities and jurisdictions, not all of the citizens agree. So there are quite a number of Fond du Lac tribal citizens who don't agree with that decision. So we're seeing that all play out, I think, throughout Minnesota. Some people have gotten very lucrative jobs with Enbridge and see it as an inevitable project, replacement project, which is how Enbridge has been framing it. But, there is quite a bit of nuanced disagreement, both among Native folks and non-Native folks along this route.
One of the things the United Nations has been talking about with climate change is it's time to reassess what they call permanent infrastructure. And this is a classic example of that. How does that international debate about climate change things going on the ground?
Yes, well, and that's what, you're seeing the folks who are opposing the pipeline is saying that, yes, we need to start looking at transition. And of course, the proponents say, well, you can't, if we switched it off, we wouldn't be able to drive our cars and everything would come to a stop. And I don't think that that is what the folks that oppose the pipeline are, in any way suggesting. That one has to start somewhere, and investing this enormous amounts of money in continuing to build this infrastructure is a place where people might want to make a change. So there would probably be, I think, in their vision, that there would be some rough spots in the transition, but it's time to stop spending that much money on continuing these infrastructures, I think, is very much the stand of the opponents to the pipeline.
What's the mood of the folks on the line, the water protectors?
Well, they seem to feel pretty strongly about it. You have Native folks, you have non-Native folks. So it's interesting. There are, this is a over 300-mile, almost 400-mile project. Enbridge is keen to get it finished as soon as possible. So they are moving. They are, have, I think, my gosh, at least 15 different locations at which they are working along this route, and we're seeing quite a number of camps of water protectors, Native and non-Native church groups, groups that are sort of more, focusing around women. So there are quite a few groups, of people on the ground. And, there are some people who are, emerging pipeline protectors. I've been hearing about some people emerging on the Fond du Lac Reservation who actually came out to challenge the people on this Camp McGazee in Fond du Lac who are opposing the pipeline.
Well, indeed, Enbridge is pretty sophisticated in how it lobbies tribal people and tribal governments.
Yes, they certainly are. I think they are part owners of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And that was the pipeline project that we know quite famously, infamously was opposed, through the Standing Rock Reservation. And I think they learned a great deal. And you're not seeing them coming forward with using rubber bullets or, using these water cannons at sub-zero temperatures against elders. I don't think you would ever see Enbridge doing anything like that. They have been able to offer, enough money and fund many projects and charities on the ground. So they have won a lot of goodwill among Native people and non-Native people, and some of these small municipalities and small counties that are really, traditionally a lot of these areas have been dependent upon kind of one extractive industry or another. It was really settled based on that first. I think we were talking about trapping really initially, and moved to timber and mining, and then now, we're at this pipeline, and I think that is sort of like embedded in the economy and the people's view of the economy and the way that they live their lives. So what people are talking about is, a pretty profound change to the way people live their lives there.
Well, and I think, and this is another thing that came through in your stories, is that change is frightening.
Yes, big time. Yes, we are seeing, people have done well. Well, it's traditional. We were seeing that Enbridge has actually the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission mandated that they fund some money for policing because they were concerned, all the money that was spent at Standing Rock, that some of these smaller communities would be on the hook for that. So, but what that means is, that not only does it pay for policing, but probably pays for other stuff. Some of these communities are pretty small. And as I said, it has bought a lot of goodwill. And there was an incident that I wrote about in the town of Palisades, a very small community south of Grand Rapids in Minnesota, in which the sheriff pretty clearly comes down in favor of Enbridge shortly after Enbridge donated $5,000 to his department. And so these things, they create, although they may not be illegal, they certainly do create a bad impression, I think. And people are very concerned about that, and I think they should be.
We have less than a minute. What's next in your series?
What I'm really wanting to look at is, we just spoke a moment ago about the sophistication of companies like Enbridge, this whole management style of what's called social corporate responsibility, and what that means and how companies leverage that. So that's very exciting. I'm very interested in looking into that.
Thank you, Annette Pember.
Thank you for having me, Mark.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world today. Thank you for watching. We'll be back with another edition tomorrow. I'm Mark Trahant.
Indian Country Today is recorded at the Phoenix Indian School Visitor Center in Phoenix, Arizona.
This is Indian Country Today.